Here at Pondering Politics, one of the things we wanted to do before the election and after is talk to interesting people. And I brought back one of the most interesting members of the United States House of Representatives, Congressman Dan Goldman of New York's 10th District. Second time on the show, third time talking, because Congressman, I don't know if you remember, I think it was the highlight, quite frankly, for you. The DNC, you and I bumped into each other on Media Row. You sat down and had a conversation. How have you been, Congressman?
I'm good. Very nice and appreciative introduction. We're hanging in. We're ready to rumble as needed, and ready to continue to focus on both preserving our democracy and improving the lives of every American.
Well, it's definitely going to be tall order with a Republican president, a Republican in control of the House of Representatives, a Republican Senate Majority Leader, a supermajority on the Supreme Court. You are facing some serious headwinds, sir. I asked you the first time we met. I said, listen, you had a successful career as a prosecutor. You were actually the lead counsel on the first Trump impeachment inquiry. And then for some reason, and I'm convinced you lost a bet, you decided to run for Congress and then run for re-election. Congratulations on your victory. Are you having any second thoughts now?
No, I don't. I wish we were not in this situation. I wish that we could be moving forward with so many of the policy priorities that the Democratic Party has to give every American access to the American dream. And that is really the foundational principle of the Democratic Party. It is not the foundational principle of the Republican Party, no matter how much Donald Trump says that he will help the middle class. But we are where we are, and certainly I've been in this position before, where we're going to have to push back against the lawlessness and the danger that Donald Trump represents.
Well, I should say we've got so much to talk about, especially like stuff that happened earlier today even. But let's talk about this first, because you said, the goal of the Democratic Party is to make lives better for the American people, not just your voters, but conservatives as well, red states, red cities, Trump voters. And though, unfortunately, I think it has not been fully recognized or appreciated yet, I would argue and have argued that President Biden's administration and Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate for the first 2 years of the Biden administration did just that. And, sir, has it occurred to you just how frustrating it is that Trump will potentially be reaping the political rewards of the Democrats' effort as infrastructure projects continue to manifest? We saw that, this year there's a $2,000 out-of-pocket cap for Medicare expenses, a drug price negotiation as a consequence of the IRA. That's in effect now. Trump's going to try to take credit for it.
Oh, 100%. And he is inheriting what is actually a terrific economy. Unemployment is at 4%. Inflation is down, getting closer to the 2%, under 3% now. The job growth, GDP growth, wages are growing. What President Biden did is completely rejuvenate a destroyed economy after COVID. What didn't happen yet is that the prices of everyday costs of life have not retreated to the point they were at before the pandemic. And so everything costs more, and Americans feel that pinch. And ultimately, Donald Trump was able to persuade Americans that he will help alleviate those cost increases better than Kamala Harris will. And I don't know how he's going to do that, because the two policies I've heard him talk about are tariffs, which notoriously increase prices for the consumer, and tax cuts for the billionaires and the super wealthy, which will come on the back of middle-class Americans and will ultimately make their pocketbooks a lot smaller. But that's what he promised. And so we're going to hold him to that, because that's what the American people voted for on November 5th. And they did not vote for authoritarianism. They did not vote for political retribution. They did not vote for pardons for violent protesters on January 6th of 2021. They focused on the pocketbook issues, and it is on Donald Trump and the Republican Senate and the Republican House to come through for those people who believed him.
Yeah, so you said so much there. I definitely want to unpack. I will close the loop on the president's record that Trump will inherit. One of the best things about this freshman class of Democrats in the House, and I include you, Congressman Frost, Congressman Moskowitz, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, and others, is that you all have been really changing the tenor and the rhetoric. You know, Democrats have had a reputation, whether we like it or not, as being meek and mild and timid and playing by civility politics. You all really brought the fight, particularly in the Oversight Committee, to these bad faith MAGA Republican talking points. And I hope that it is a priority for Democrats moving forward, that as Trump tries to take credit for your hard work and the hard work of the Biden administration, you don't accept that framing and you relentlessly push back. You said you talked about Trump wanting to lower grocery prices. Congressman, I don't think you're being fair. He just announced today that one of his priorities is to rename the Gulf of Mexico. And your colleague, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, said that she's instructing her staff to draft the legislation as we speak. So you don't see the obvious connection, Congressman, to renaming the Gulf of Mexico and plummeting grocery prices? You're a smart guy.
In there, I mean, it's preposterous. And in there, but I'll take it even further. In their rules package, which they passed last week, which sets the rules for this Congress, they also included 12 bills, 12 pieces of legislation that basically are approved through the rule, which means that they can be brought to the floor of the House. None of them have anything to do with pocketbook issues, with affordability, with housing, with the rising costs of medical care and health care, with the rising costs of child care, with paid family leave, with basic fundamental benefits that, you know, is the bare minimum that we should be offering Americans in this country so that they can get access to the American dream, and nothing on education. It is just a continuation of the culture battles that they are lifting up and amplifying, and that, you know, frankly, we don't spend any time talking about here. When we're talking about the prescription drug prices. We're talking about the infrastructure bill and rebuilding our roads and bridges and bringing us into the 21st century. I'm talking about offshore wind and all of the incentives created for renewable energy in the Inflation Reduction Act.
Which I should also say, Congressman, not to interrupt, but to point out, to really put a pin on this, so many of those benefits are going to red states and red district. Your colleague Lauren Boebert, her first district, I think before she flipped, if I'm not mistaken, benefited immensely from investments from the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. I imagine it, just to really put a point on this, it's got to be frustrating to see and hear these people who either voted against it or whipped against it or opposed it, not only benefiting from it, but really going out of their way to try to take credit for themselves, like the dispensation of funds.
100%. They always show up at the groundbreaking when there's a project that the federal government funded that they voted against. And they always try to take credit. But you're right, Josiah, we need to make sure that we are calling out to the American people who is responsible for the economy, who is responsible for the immense investment that we have in renewable energy, which is creating tens of thousands of jobs, is actually the only way to create true energy independence. You can drill as much oil as you want. Oil prices still depend on our adversaries in Iran and Saudi Arabia and Russia and China. If we make our own energy right here, we don't need to worry about the OPEC and oil prices. The list goes on and on and on. And one of the difficult things about politics is that ultimately good policy often takes a long time to be tangibly felt by the electorate. But the politics happens up front. And so Joe Biden gets a bad rap because of inflation, when what we're seeing right now is inflation going down because of his policies. And all of these benefits, all of these infrastructure projects and renewable energy projects and lowering costs of prescription drugs, all of that is a result of Joe Biden and the Democrats. And you can be sure we're going to make that known.
I really appreciate it. I'm glad to hear it. As a matter of fact, I was really happy when the president himself 3 weeks ago, I think he said in front of the Brennan Institute, he said one of the things he learned from Donald Trump, put your name on the checks. Now, I understand why the president was reticent to do that, because in a bygone time, that would be seen as crass and crude. But Donald Trump has changed how politics are played. And we're definitely going to be talking about that more. You mentioned Kash Patel. And you know, Kash Patel to me is, for those who watch channel but may have missed it, Kash Patel is a Trump sycophant, also a celebrated children's book author, congressman. I don't know if you know that, where he wrote his book about the plot against the king, lionizing, monarching Donald Trump, and he's potentially going to be the director of the FBI. He has vowed to pursue Donald Trump's political opponents, people in the media, people who supposedly rigged the 2020 election. And I got to thinking, you know, when we were setting this conversation up, you were the lead impeachment counsel in the first attempt to impeach Donald Trump. Is Dan Goldman's name on a list somewhere?
Yeah, probably. I mean, it is actually on a list. I'm not sure if it's on his list. But yeah, look, he a year and a half ago, when we had a hearing with a couple of witnesses who were FBI whistleblowers, I asked a question about what their relationship and connection to Kash Patel was, and he had sent each of them money. I then said on my official Twitter account that these witnesses were bought and paid for by Kash Patel. He sent a criminal referral to the Department of Justice. Obviously, this Department of Justice didn't act on it, but you can imagine a scenario where, as FBI director, he goes in there and inherits a criminal referral from himself for completely unfounded and baseless allegations, but that he initiates the investigation. I'm not as worried about me as I am about many of the hardworking Americans, public servants, who have simply been doing their job and doing their job with such expertise and real professionalism that he has threatened to go after. And make no mistake, his only qualification for this job is that he has promised to go after Donald Trump's enemies. And this is somebody who worked with Devin Nunes back in 2018, I think, or 17, when they brought classified information to the White House as part of the House investigation on the Russia investigation. This is a guy who did an end run around his superiors in the National Security Council to be the go-between with Donald Trump on the Ukraine stuff that ultimately led to his impeachment. This is a guy who has threatened retribution against anyone who disagrees with Donald Trump. If you have, as the director of the FBI, the person who is principally charged with not only investigating violations of criminal law, but counterintelligence, counterterrorism, the safety of our country, and his sole focus is political retribution, he is putting every American in serious danger, far more danger than we are in right now. And not only that, he is undermining and would undermine the credibility of every single case in the FBI. Yes, for sure, the ones that are political, that's obvious that those are politically done. But if you make one a political retribution, then you call into credibility every other investigation. And that's really the danger of how far this can descend, because it's not just political retribution against the January 6th investigators, against the special counsel, against the media, against me or whomever. it undermines the basic foundational principles and credibility of the entire FBI. And that is how our democracy crumbles.
Yeah, it's truly terrifying. I mean, Kash Patel's one of many. Pete Hegseth, a former Weekend Fox News host, potentially becoming Secretary of Defense. Tulsi Gabbard, potentially becoming the Director of National Intelligence. As a member of the House of Representatives, you are not part of the body that confirms these nominees. But as if they do get confirmed, assuming that you remain on oversight, which, by the way, have assignments been revealed? Can you talk about where you're going to be, or is that not disclosed yet?
Not yet. I think next week they get finalized.
Fair enough. Well, oversight in the House would have jurisdiction over these bodies. I'll just ask you a free for all question. Are you worried about all of Trump's nominees? Only most of Trump's nominees? Are there some that truly concern you more than others? Can you talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, and in fact, that's actually a very important point. Some of the nominees are excellent. I don't agree with Marco Rubio on a lot of things, but he's certainly qualified as the former lead Republican on the Senate Intelligence Committee to be a Secretary of State. I think Doug Burgum is a very successful businessman and governor, and will be perfectly fine as the Department of Interior. You've got Mike Waltz, a colleague of mine who is, I think qualified to be National Security Advisor. There are other ones that are perfectly legitimate, and I don't agree with many of their policies, but that's the consequence of elections. And what the Senate must do is uphold their oath to the Constitution and their advice and consent responsibility to make sure that those who are appointed by the president to take these positions will follow the rule of law and follow the Constitution. But the fact that he can appoint nominees who are capable and qualified just goes to show how intentional his decision to appoint Tulsi Gabbard and Kash Patel and Pete Hegseth and Matt Gaetz is, because he specifically wants to weaponize the Department of Justice, the FBI, the intelligence community, the institutions of accountability, the institutions that can hold him accountable for any efforts he makes to become a dictator, to become authoritarian, to use his worst impulses. And so that's why it's so scary that these are the people that he has selected for these specific agencies, because it is clear that what his intention is to politically weaponize these agencies for his own benefit.
You mentioned holding Donald Trump accountable, and these are organic conversations. And while you were saying, I was just thinking, we just heard breaking news a couple of hours ago that Trump-appointed Judge Eileen Cannon decided to block the Department of Justice from issuing, my understanding is like a perfunctory, maybe even statutorily required report, if I'm not mistaken, about the investigation, in particular the so-called classified documents investigation. So number one, I was curious, have you heard about this? Number two, what are your thoughts on it? And number three, I'm not an attorney. She dismissed the case. Is this even in her jurisdiction? Like, can she order the DOJ not to issue a report? Can you talk about this?
Yeah, look, it's a somewhat more complicated issue because there were two co-defendants in that case who still remain in the case. And they made a request that a special counsel report on the classified documents case related to Donald Trump, which is required by regulation to be written. They made the case that that should not be disclosed to the public. It is at the Attorney General's discretion whether or not to make it public. So the special counsel must write a report, but the Attorney General gets to decide whether or not to make it public and what parts of it will become public. Remember, Joe Biden, as president, was also investigated by a special counsel related to classified documents, special counsel Robert Hur. He submitted a lengthy report, which went far beyond the type of analysis that a prosecutor would ordinarily make
It was a
into a
brilliantly written op-ed, Congressman.
political, exactly. And there were no objections to it being released publicly, and Merrick Garland did release the full thing publicly, even though I think there were very good arguments that part of it went against department policy. And that wasn't even enough for the Republicans because they wanted the interview with Joe Biden that he did, not just the report, but the interview. So then they gave the Republicans a transcript of the interview, but even that wasn't enough. They then needed the actual recording of the interview. And ultimately, Merrick Garland said, no, there's no legitimate purpose to getting a recording when you have the transcript. It's just to use it for political advantage. And he was held in contempt of Congress for that. And so it is, of course, the hypocrisy is sort of the rule, not the exception. But the notion that Donald Trump is trying to suppress the two special counsel reports related to two criminal cases that were dismissed simply because he was and will be once again president of the United States, really redefines chutzpah. And it's one thing to get your cases dismissed because you're the only person in this country who's above the law. It's entirely something else to try to hide the conduct from the voters because you don't want it to come out. And that's what he's trying to do. And this is an alarm for all of us out here to say that's absurd. And this should not at all be suppressed in any way. And that obviously he thinks that if he can get it to January 21st, his administration will suppress it because the assumption, of course, is that they're corrupt and that they're not going to follow basic norms and rules. But
I'd say that's probability
really
more than assumption, to be fair to you, Congressman. I'd say it's a matter of probability.
Yeah. So that is really what he's asking for right now. And it's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. And of course, you don't hear any Republicans in the House or the Senate standing up for the principle that special counsel reports are always released to Congress. At least they have been in recent times. And God forbid that the Republicans and the majority in the Senate and the House might actually want to know what Donald Trump's conduct was. No, of course not. I mean, they've just completely abdicated their own individual responsibility to uphold the Constitution. And they are more and more in ways that are very scary, just vessels of Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's really an authoritarian cult. I mean, I shouldn't have been stunned, but I was when, your former colleague, Matt Gaetz, resigned from Congress in an attempt to preempt the ethics committee from releasing that report. And Mike Johnson shamelessly, put his thumb on the scale and said that he was going to lobby the Republican-led bipartisan ethics committee to not only not publicly disclose the report, but to keep it from your Senate counterparts, which was extraordinary. There is no limit, no limiting principle for this. I will ask you, though, as a point of clarification, what about the January 6th special counsel case that Special Counsel Smith voluntarily withdrew? Does he have to issue a report on that or just the classified documents case?
No, he has to issue a report on that as well.
Given that January 6th case was under the purview of Judge Tanya Chutkan, Judge Cannon presumably can't block DOJ from releasing that report, correct? Because it's a separate jurisdiction.
That's right. I think that's right. I don't necessarily know if it is clear. It is certainly clear that Donald Trump's trying to prevent both reports from being released. Judge Cannon only has jurisdiction over the classified document case, and in this instance, really only because there are two co-defendants, so the case is still alive, and the argument is that there's some prejudice to the co-defendants if the special counsel outlines in great detail, which I expect he will, the conduct of both these co-defendants and Donald Trump. There's no such argument to be made in the January 6th case. I don't know what plausible argument they would have to suppress it other than Donald Trump just doesn't want it to be released. But we're what, 2 weeks away from him taking over, and all he's trying to do, and same with his sentencing in New York, is just get it past January 20th.
Run
Uh,
run out the clock. Yeah, and I should say, Congressman, to close the loop on this, I'm curious. Um, I personally have been frustrated, reading legal opinions and the opinions of career prosecutors. Former Attorney General Eric Holder was quite frank about this. Um, it seems to be an increasing consensus that, looking back, Attorney General Garland, who seems to be a very intelligent, very well-meaning man, was not as expedient in pursuit of Donald Trump as he could have been. There's credible legal analysis to suggest that DOJ really dragged its feet for about a year, particularly with regards to January 6th. Now that it's over, to the extent that you're comfortable, how do you feel about the prosecutions of Donald Trump as a prosecutor yourself?
Well, first of all, being on the inside, I do have a better sense of what barriers and obstacles there sometimes are, but also B, that there may have been covert investigative steps that were taken during that year that we don't know about. I hope that will come out and we'll get a more exhaustive recitation of what exactly the timeline was. But yes, I think there are legitimate concerns that Merrick Garland waited too long to begin an investigation into Trump and his inner circle. I will say, though, that he falls well behind, in my book, those who may be responsible for where we are today. Number one is Mitch McConnell, who, if he had gotten 9 more, along with himself, Republicans, to add to the 7 who voted to convict Donald Trump at the second impeachment trial, which, based on his comments, you would think that he would have wanted to do, or he believed, then Donald Trump would have never been able to run for office again, and we would not be here. And that is the political process taking care of the political process. The number 2 is the Supreme Court, in what was a clear overreaching opinion giving broad immunity to the president of the United States, and taking their sweet time in doing that. So yes, I think you could quibble with with some of the timing. Jack Smith, when he got on board, he
hit the ground running. He did
incredibly quickly. There was a lot of litigation behind the scenes on grand jury stuff. They were incredibly aggressive, and they put together what, from the indictment at least, was a very strong case. And so, I think from a prosecutor's perspective, I have the utmost respect for Jack Smith. And when he came in, things turned around. But that was 2 years in to the 4 years. And so, I do wish that there had been more urgency on the part of DOJ. But I don't hold Merrick Garland the least bit responsible for the fact that Donald Trump is where we are today and has seemingly escaped accountability yet again.
Yeah, no, to be sure. I mean, the brick wall, in my opinion, of democracy is this current Supreme Court. Your colleague, Jamie Raskin, wrote a brilliant op-ed years ago, actually, during the first Trump administration, where he made the case that, listen, this idea that we have 3 co-equal branches, it's actually not true. Congress was supposed to be first among equals. You all were always supposed to be the final hand on top. The president overrides or vetoes your legislation. In theory, you can override the presidential veto. And I feel like in our current paradigm, we have a Supreme Court which effectively is the final hand on top. It seems like they can give you all orders. They can certainly give the executive orders, as we've seen during the Biden administration, and they resist any and all accountability. It's insane. You all, I believe, have a $50 gift limit. If you go $51 and over, it's got to be reported or rejected. The Supreme Court of the United States, 9 unelected clerics, they have no accountability whatsoever. It is truly a gross miscarriage of democracy. And I will say, Congressman, moving forward, should you all ever get the majority again, which I think you stand a very good chance in the next midterms, I hope that Supreme Court oversight is a priority for Democrats, because Trump is the immediate problem now. But I would argue an entrenched right-wing supermajority is as dangerous. It's more looming. So food for thought there.
Well, I introduced a bill that would create an independent ethics office that would have to review all conflicts of interest and financial disclosures, as well as an independent investigative arm of the Supreme Court that would enforce a binding ethics code, because it is absurd that the highest court in the land has the lowest ethical standards and that there isn't a binding ethics code on them, and they pick and choose whether they want to recuse themselves from cases where their wives have clear factual involvement and a vested interest in these cases. And there's nothing right now that can be done, and that's something that we will certainly work to fix.
I hope so, because again, it's just the least accountable branch, the least democratic branch having the most power and the least accountability it's truly like a trigger.
Well, look, ultimately, right, we have the power of the purse, and the most drastic and dramatic action still lies with us, which is that we could defund the Supreme Court. That would create a constitutional crisis of another sort. But this notion that Alito put forward last year about how Congress does not have jurisdiction over the Supreme Court is just absolutely absurd and belied by the plain text of the Constitution, which he is responsible for interpreting. So we are descending into a kind of never land of constitutional interpretation with some of these Supreme Court justices.
Oh yeah, it's so frustrating. Of course, the first word that came to mind was oligarchy, which of course segues me quite nicely into where we are with. I'm not sure how you guys are going to do this. If Elon Musk enters the room, do you play Hail to the Chief, or is that Donald Trump? Is it Mr. President Musk? Here we have the world's richest man, Congressman, who contributed, I believe, at last public disclosure, somewhere between $250 and $270 million to the effort to get Donald Trump elected, actively intruding himself in the legislative process in a way we've never seen before. And now he's doing it to other countries. I do want to ask you about the relationship between the Trump administration and Elon Musk, but quite frankly, even other wealthy social media users, because not to throw a lot at you, earlier today, Donald Trump said at Mar-a-Lago that he believes that the recent changes made by Mark Zuckerberg to Facebook and Instagram about, moving their moderation team from California to Texas and removing fact checkers. He also contributed $1 million to Trump's inauguration fund. Trump himself admitted he thinks it's because it's the threats he's made against Musk or against Zuckerberg in the past, including the threat to jail him for life. So can you talk about this oligarchic, nexus, which is at the heart of the Trump administration between Elon Musk and others?
It's very scary. And, Jeff Bezos squashing a political cartoon in the Washington Post related to him giving money to the dear leader, Donald Trump. The fact that there are so many tech moguls who are giving money to Trump's inauguration, which we all know is the fastest way to his heart. It's very scary that Trump so clearly has given over some degree of control to the world's wealthiest man. And it's even scarier when you start to hear the rumors about Donald Trump selling Truth Social to Elon Musk's X, both private companies. Who's going to gauge whether or not this is a complete windfall? So Trump has every financial interest to suck up to Musk and is clearly doing that. And of course, we know he doesn't care about the American people. He doesn't care about the public interest. He cares solely about himself. And so I think if I give the best gloss I can put on this is that some of these business leaders believe that they get more bees with honey than vinegar, and that if they make nice with Trump, they'll be spared his irrational wrath. The problem with that is that's all fine and dandy if you're talking about tariffs, or if you're, talking about uh, business, or, business dealings. But if Donald Trump starts to erode and undermine our democracy, upon which all of these oligarchs rely, all of their businesses are dependent on our democracy, our democratic values, our capital markets, our infrastructure, economic infrastructure that we have here, and they remain silent, then they are complicit in the destruction of our democracy. Because in the first term, a lot of business leaders stood up against Trump, some of the immigration policies, some of the other anti-democratic efforts. There was a strong backlash that Trump faced, not just from the people, but also from business leaders, who are the ones that he clearly listens to the most. If they're all now as sycophantish as Kash Patel and the Republicans in the House and the Senate, then we are descending into some really, really dark and scary days. And so it is very concerning, and will be especially concerning if they go along with Trump's worst impulses.
Well, and that segues to what is, in my opinion, the most important question, and this is something that you're actually the first elected official that I'm starting to ask this question to, but it's one moving forward. I'm going to be speaking tomorrow with Senator Whitehouse, and I plan to ask him this question as well. But let's consider the current landscape. The presidency is about to be turned over to a naked authoritarian who, again, just today said, yeah, me threatening to jail a social media mogul is why he is making changes to his platform, which will benefit me. Staggering. He has the presidency. His party will have the House. It will have the Senate. It has a supermajority on the Supreme Court, a majority of state legislatures. The biggest mainstream news network is basically a Republican propaganda piece, Fox. They had to pay nearly $800 million in a loyalty tithe effectively to Trump. You have digital media like the Daily Wire, Tim Pool, Joe Rogan, and others, which have a right-wing bent. You have all of these things. You have Elon Musk, the world's richest man, and Twitter, and all the power that wields as well. With all of this in mind, Congressman, a lot of people, myself included, I'm not necessarily the morale captain here in terms of YouTube commentary. I try to keep it real. A lot of us are concerned, and we're looking to our elected officials for reassurance that they are aware that this is not business as usual. This is not just, this is not Mitt Romney winning in 2012. This is not John McCain winning in 2008. This is something very different. It's actually very different than Trump winning in 2016. And what we want to know is, do you all recognize that this is not business as usual? Are you working on a plan? I'm sure you don't have one yet because this is huge, right? This is a work in progress. But are you working on a strategy to take power? And then when you take power in the next election or next elections, is there a plan to wield that power decisively? Not exactly the same as Republicans do, obviously, but boldly, to not just temporarily hold it back the way that President Biden did, with all due respect to the president, but to reverse that momentum. Can you talk about that a bit? Because I think people are looking for reassurance. Not that everything is okay, but that you know what the situation is and it is being taken seriously.
Yeah, look, the short answer is absolutely. And I got into this world by being the lead counsel on Donald Trump's first impeachment inquiry, where he withheld military assistance to Ukraine, who was in a hot war against Russia that, of course, we now know has exploded, in order to extort Ukraine to help his campaign. That seems quaint compared to what he did January 6th, what he's done with the classified documents, what he has promised to do with his nominees. And so I think there's, look, a multi-pronged strategy here. Yes, the first thing we have, I mean, not the first thing, but what ultimately we need to do over the next 2 years is make it so that we certainly take back the House in the majority so we can have some control and provide a much greater check and balance on everything that Trump wants to do. Maybe the Senate, although that's going to be difficult just in terms of the cycle. But there are two different avenues that I see where we're going right now. One is going to be legislative. Okay. He's going to have a much tougher road to hoe legislatively than he thinks. The House majority right now for the Republicans is 2. And we saw how dysfunctional the House Republicans were last Congress in not being able to agree on much of anything. Many of them just want to burn the House down. They are incapable of passing a budget without Democrats. They are going to be incapable of raising the debt ceiling without Democrats. So there are going to be times when we have leverage. And what I and many others are urging is that we be willing to go to the mat to use that leverage, because it doesn't come along very often. And when it does, we have to be willing to make some sacrifices. We have to be willing to shut the government down if need be, because the only way that we're going to get our priorities through is by playing hardball. And I mean much harder ball than we played in December, where we were able to stave off some of the worst possibilities, but there were bipartisan priorities that were originally agreed to that really were at our insistence that ultimately didn't get in. So that's one aspect of it. On the other side is what goes on in the executive branch. And we talked a lot about these nominees. Right now, our focus has to be on opposing the really egregious nominees. And that, in large part, requires us to make sure that everyone understands that it is not just Democrats who are responsible for our democracy and our Constitution. Republicans take an oath to the Constitution, not to Donald Trump. They should not escape accountability by just going along with Trump's authoritarian instincts. They are responsible for our democracy. The Senate has an advice and consent responsibility to ensure that our cabinet officials are not just political sycophants trying to get retribution on political enemies like you would see in a banana republic. And so it is going to be on the Senate Republicans, given that they're in the majority, to uphold our Constitution. And one of the things that we can do is continue to put pressure on some of those purple state Republicans. Tom Tillis in North Carolina has re-election.
That's my state. Yep.
Yeah. You've got Susan Collins. You've got some of the Republicans in more moderate states who need to be held accountable for their acquiescence to Donald Trump's authoritarianism. And they need to be able to stand up for what is right and what is constitutional, not whatever Donald Trump wants. And so the message will evolve. The challenges will come. It's now the nominations. It will be plenty of other things that are going to, the tax cuts for the wealthy that are coming in reconciliation. But we as a coalition, both on the inside and on the outside, through folks like you and other engaged Americans, have a voice that matters and resonates. And it's going to be really important that we all together join in and focus on the right things that are the most dangerous and serious threats, and band together to prevent the true dismantling of our democracy. So I'm my eyes are wide open. I know we're in for it. I certainly will be in the trenches fighting every day to make sure that Donald Trump remembers that he won the election because he made all these promises to the middle class, not because he promised political retribution, not because he promised to pardon the January 6th criminals. And we're going to make sure that he is held to his promises, along with the help from those Americans who truly support democracy.
Well, listen, I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad that you're definitely taking it seriously. I'll also point out again, just to give you guys props. I know December didn't go exactly the way you wanted in terms of your priorities, but where I'm proud of you guys, Congressman, is I was half expecting Democrats to cave on the debt ceiling. Where I'm glad is you dug your feet in. You said, no, Republicans play games with the debt ceiling every time Democrats are in power, even when Republicans are the ones who rack up the debt. And you said, no, you guys have that landslide, that mandate. You all can flip the debt ceiling when Trump is inaugurated. I'm just really impressed that you all dug your heels in on that.
And let's not fool ourselves. The reason he wanted to raise the debt ceiling is that he didn't want to take responsibility for needing to raise the debt ceiling with his tax cuts for billionaires. And that is going to increase the deficit, but he doesn't care. He's trying to placate the billionaires, the oligarchs that we talked about. And it's going to come on the backs of the vast, vast majority of the American people. 83% of the benefits from his 2017 tax bill went to the top 1% of earners in America. And he has promised to do the same thing again.
No, and like I said, I'm glad you guys played tough with it. You played a little bit like Republicans do. They need to be the ones to accrue the political consequence of raising the debt ceiling to do exactly what you're talking about. If you want to add to the national debt to screw over, everyday hardworking Americans, then Republicans, you need to do that. We're not going to do it for you. I was just really impressed by that. Congressman, I appreciate it so much. I'm looking forward to what this next year brings in terms of the meaningful resistance you all will be able to provide. I'm excited to also see the committee assignments. You said next week you expect, or perfect. Congressman, I appreciate your time. I'm looking forward to chatting with you in the future. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Josiah. Thanks for the great conversation.
All right, Congressman.